Ladies and gentlemen, I think we probably should make a start because we're already a little bit overrun and we don't want to be particularly late for the last session. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to this session, which is entitled Curriculum Reform with a particular emphasis on TVET, Technical and Vocational Education and Training. Don't be put off, it could cover anything to do with curriculum and probably lots of other things besides, particularly around things like youth development, development for the less advantaged, rural development, etc., etc. So it will, I suspect, be fairly far-ranging. I have three eminent panelists. A fourth may appear, but the three I'm sure will survive very well with. Just before we start, I just want to pick up one or two very quick points. You don't want to hear from me. You heard from me yesterday, some of you. But the theme of this conference increasingly seems to be around skills. It increasingly seems to be around how industry and education work together. We've heard a lot about youth unemployment, youth development. We've also heard about the development of adults, career changes and such like, and the solutions which we need to find in order to be able to really develop human capital and at the same time improve competitiveness within a global environment. So it's been a very wide-ranging set of issues that we've been tackling. And underpinning all of that, of course, is the teaching and the learning that we do within our institutions, whether they be schools, technical institutions, universities, and of course within the workplace. And there are many other solutions that we will be hearing about today from our panelists that we can look at to try and help support the development of human capital. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce my first panelist, a very good friend of mine, Manfred Polzin, who's from the Association of Colleges, MBO Raad, in the Netherlands. So, over to you, Manfred.
Thank you, Sue. I prefer to stay. Okay. Good morning. Good afternoon already. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to tell you something about the way we have organized in the Netherlands the cooperation between VET providers and the world of work, let's say the trade and industry. My name is Manfred Polzin. I'm working for the Association of Colleges, and we are in the Netherlands advocating let's say the voice of all the colleges. We are not a government agencies, but we are put up by the colleges themselves. Coming to our system, we have in the Netherlands a mainly output-based system. It means in fact that providers, together with trade and industry, they are defining the requested output. They are responsible for the competence profiles. They are in close cooperation. So there's 50% of there's one foundation where 50% of the people there is representing the colleges and 50% is representing the world of trade and industry. And together they are defining, let's say, what should be learned. And it is up to the colleges to decide how to do it. Does that mean that everybody is happy? Well, in general terms, it can always be better, but altogether, I think, and if I compare our system with some system in other countries, I think we are doing not that bad. One of the most important things what we have achieved is that there is in every a learning pathway, in every VET learning pathway, there is a certain degree of duality. It is completely impossible to learn a profession without entering into a company. have two learning pathways. There's a work-based learning pathway. You can compare to the German system, the dual system. There's another learning pathway which is more school-based. And depending on the demands from the labor market, it is either more young people making a choice for the work-based learning pathway. And if the industry has not a big demand, there's more school-based. But it is all in the same qualification structure. I think that's well, as I already said, a very strong point that there is a feeling of a joint ownership of the system between providers and between the world of trade and industry. Very, very important is it to try to overcome any isolation. I mean, isolation. I've seen it so often that schools are not coming into the world of trade and industry, and the world of trade and industry is not entering the schools. So what I really like to see, and what we are trying to achieve in the Netherlands, is indeed that there are guest lecturers from companies coming into the schools, and that the schools are regularly teachers, that they know how companies look like. And this is also, I think when it has been mentioned several times these days. Yesterday I've heard it this morning a few times, that many young people in many countries, they prefer degrees, they prefer academic studies, and I think it's one of the main challenges we are all facing, and meanwhile I'm convinced that it is from the Far East to South America. It's obviously almost everywhere the same challenge, that we need to raise the status of vocational education and training. It is somehow a kind of Cinderella in the world of education, and we have to transform this Cinderella into a beautiful mermaid or whatever. And how can we reach that? How can we reach this parity of esteem of vocational education with more academic studies? Well, I think quality is a very, very important point here. We need to have good teachers, not the best teachers going to the academic side, but also the best teachers going to vocational education and training. And we have to show, to demonstrate that vocational education and training is in a kind of other road to excellency. It should be not a dead-end vocational education and training. Now, through vocational education and training, it should be possible to reach the highest levels as well. I was recently in Switzerland. I spoke to somebody from a company. They were making hydraulic pumps, world leading class. And he said, we have employed 55 engineers. Out of these 55 engineers, 50 of them came through vocational education and training to the top. They only had 5 people with an academic background. 50, they learned it by combining working learning, but world leading. I think I'll leave it here. I think that's the message. How can we develop learning pathways that goes from plumber to PhD?
Thank you very much, Manfred. Thank you. I think your points are very well made about teacher education and good quality teachers. I think that's essential. And I think also one of the things that I think is true to say in the Netherlands, that in your system, youth unemployment is quite low. Less than 10% still?
It's raising now. It's now about towards 10%.
Around 10%, but that's still low compared to many other countries. Which brings me on then to our next speaker, which is Clare Woodcroft. Clare is the Chief Executive Officer of the Emirates Foundation here in the United Arab Emirates. And she'll tell you very much about the whole issue of youth development, youth unemployment, and some of the very interesting schemes that the Emirates Foundation has put into place to try and tackle some of the issues of really poorly educated or less motivated young people here within the Emirates.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, indeed. So I head up Emirates Foundation, which is focused on youth development. So my caveats here are that I will be looking kind of primarily at the UAE, but also more broadly at the Arab region, where I've worked for many years. I think in Emirates Foundation, what we see as youth development is, and particularly because we are a philanthropic organization, is that we fill the gap between the public and the private sector. So we are not about training programs or about education per se. We believe that there are others doing that better than us. So we have to step back and look more holistically at, so what are the other things you can do to help young people navigate their career path and personal development path? And I think one of the things we see where there's a bit of a gap is around career exploration, about really helping young people think from an early age, what is it that I want to do when I get older, and what kind of career do I want to have? I think there's some interesting insights from bloggers around Generation Y saying, feeling a bit mistreated by their older generation, saying we were told to go out there and dream and live our hopes and dreams and pursue a career in any area we wanted, when the economic reality today is that graduates are struggling to find jobs. So, and as my colleague was saying, so even degrees now are not necessarily a guarantee to a job. So I think what we are trying to do at Emirates Foundation is encourage people at a younger age to start thinking more creatively about what their career might look like, and in a way being a lot more strategic at a younger age about what their career might look like. We have a couple of programs that are focusing on soft skills, leadership skills for young people. We have a program called Kafa'at, which is about helping young people look at decision making, look at how they develop their team working skills, how we can make them work ready, which is something that would sit in parallel with their academic career and in parallel with any technical training, because a lot of what we're hearing from our business partners, so the private sector fund our programs, is that they find young people, young graduates are not work ready. We also have 2 very strong volunteering programs, and again, I think it's something that's perhaps overlooked, the value of volunteering. I started my career as a volunteer, and I think it's a great way for young people to really narrow down the areas in which they excel and explore opportunities for the future in terms of career. I mean, I just don't think young people these days have the luxury of indulging in various different academic courses or even vocational training when you have the kind of economic climate that we have. They really need to be focused down on what area they think they can most add value in. In the region, of course, we have the big issue of excellent progress in terms of enrollment in education over the years, but still not quite getting the levels of progress needed in terms of the quality of education. And I think there's been quite a lot of good progress, even here in the UAE and beyond, around evolving curriculum from didactic to a much more cognitive approach, to looking at much more varied methodologies in terms of delivering in the classroom, using technology, using iPads and the like. But we're still seeing a level of perhaps fear and aversion from both parents and teachers towards radically overhauling the nature of the curriculum, because sometimes what happens, and that's been proven in statistics here, is that you end up seeing higher rates of failure, of course, if you're shifting too quickly from a traditional teaching methodology to a more progressive technology-based one, and that moves away from rote learning. So again, something to take into consideration, that teachers and parents need to be brought on board if we're going to shift the curriculum into something that is more adequately producing the output that industry needs. And I think, indeed, we are seeing our private sector partners saying quite systematically that you know, and to me this is one of the core issues across the region, is we simply do not have in the region that integrated approach between academia and industry at a level whereby R&D is being driven by industry, at a level whereby academia and the private sector are closely collaborating around what is the skill set that we need. So still we hear young people, there are multiple surveys here in the region saying young people still complaining that they think the education they get does not equip them for the jobs that they think they should be applying for. Here in the UAE we see a massive growth of industrial diversification. Looking at, obviously it's an oil and gas economy, so there's a very high demand for technical skills, for engineers and scientists, which it's very difficult to meet through local talent. And what we're seeing is a lot of industries, so rather than being able to rely on technical training, are having to promote this training themselves and indeed deliver the training themselves for young graduates. So again, I think a lot more can be done in terms of connecting academia to the private sector, in terms of helping teaching staff understand what are the opportunities, what are the non-academic opportunities, and in terms of helping young people understand what skill sets they need in order to be able to secure a career. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think that was a very interesting perspective on what is a very complex problem here. And I think that the message that came out for me is that let's look at different ways of doing things, but let's not be too radical too quickly, because otherwise we'll probably end up getting into a worse mess. At the end of the day, what's really important is about quality and the quality of education and training that young people get, and also to make sure we've got some form of integrated approaches between the education system and the industry system. Which brings me on to David. David Wilson, some of you will have seen on other panels already. He's the sort of the guy that seems to be able to turn his hand to most things, I think, here. He's the director of the Asian Schools for GEMS Education, and he's going to talk about some of his experiences, I think possibly not just here within the UAE and for GEMS, but also before that.
Thank you, Sue. Does anyone need the interpreters? Okay. Good morning. Sue's quite right. I won't be talking to you about my current role as Director of Asian Schools, but I will be drawing on the perspective of a large employer in the UK. In my previous role, I was Director for Training and Education with the British Army, and we had the largest and most successful apprenticeship program in the country, and it had been so successful for at least a decade before. So it's a very established program. But I will also address some of the points that have been raised by fellow panelists about perhaps drawing lessons from that experience. To paint the picture, because most of you will be unfamiliar, the average recruit into the British Army is educationally identical to the average British citizen of that age. Point one. Point two, the average educational standard of a recruit joining the British Army, literacy and numeracy, is that of a 13-year-old. Now, you can argue who sets the 13-year-old benchmark if most of these people, of course, are 18, but it's just linked to the academic profile that people would expect. But when you test them entering the workforce, 5 years have somehow miraculously disappeared in terms of the educational profile. And by the way, I did a very informal bit of research looking at letters written home from the First World War, which was the first use of conscription in Britain. And actually, in those days, of course, education was not compulsory, apart from a few years of primary education. And the letters home were pretty much the same standard as the letters back from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Of course, the completely illiterate people wouldn't have been writing home. They'd have been getting friends to write letters for them in 1914 to 1918, but it's strange and humbling that all the progress in education, the investment in education, there is a stubborn cohort of people in the developed world who are educationally no different than that of their great-grandfathers. So 10,000 apprentices on the program, completion rates were 80% or better. We always obsessed about the 20% who didn't complete the program, but most of them didn't complete because they had actually left the army and moved on to another career. So for those who stayed, our completion rates were almost 100%, certainly within single figures of that. And part of the reason for this success was completion of the apprenticeship program was linked to pay and promotion. If you succeeded in getting through, doors opened and other things happened and you got a bit more pay. But I think just looking at extrinsic motivation was a bit too simplistic. I think the main reasons why the program was as good as it was, and I list a number of factors here. Firstly, motivation. When you're dealing with adults, you don't have to be in the classroom with them. If they're not motivated, you can walk out of the classroom and do something else. And certainly that applies to employees. You're investing in them. If they don't want to be there, if they don't want to benefit from that investment, you just turn it off. So I think motivation was always there. For many of the youngsters, it was the first thing, being successful and joining the army, passing recruit training, and then getting on the apprenticeship program was the first thing they'd been successful in their lives. And to see young men and women come into an organization and just weeks later, the basic course is 12 weeks long, just weeks later be transformed into people who felt extremely positively about themselves, was genuinely an astonishing experience. And that's what their families felt too. Joining any respected organization brings its added advantages of earning respect, having pride in yourself and the organization, and of course trying to earn and maintain the respect of your peers. Unabashedly, like many employers, the British Army places huge emphasis on getting culture right and getting our core values right. And the core values will be blazed on my memory for the rest of my life. Solid C, selfless commitment, respect for others, loyalty, integrity, discipline, and courage. You would expect that, and you would expect physical courage, but actually much more important than physical courage was moral courage. We tried to inculcate a real sense that moral courage was actually superior to physical courage. And how do you distill that to people who are joining, youngsters who are joining? Well, the catchphrase that I used to use was doing the right thing on a bad day when no one will ever know what you've done. I think if you can set that into someone's heart, that doing the right thing is important, regardless of whether you get any credit or recognition, or indeed if you do the wrong thing, whether you get any blame, you have then people who you don't need to control. They control themselves and they behave in a way that's worthy of respect. The third factor, I've done motivation and culture, is role models. And I think this plays directly to the question of how do we attract people into the vocational area. I'm afraid unless you've got powerful role models standing in front of people, convincing powerful role models, they just don't learn in the skills area. The best role model is the expert practitioner, someone who does something really well because he loves doing it, or he or she loves doing it really well. And I think one of the weaknesses in educational systems is, by and large, we don't use the right role models for teaching skills. I think also the skills have to be relevant and useful. Very often you get all sorts of added-on bits in apprenticeship programs. We try to cut all those bits out and stick to things that are relevant and useful. So within days of being exposed to a new technique or skill or knowledge, the young soldier, young apprentice would be using that skill actually at work. And to give you a personal practical example, part of your annual military training is to do various things, one of which is training for nuclear, biological and chemical warfare. It's very complicated, there's lots of bits of kit, there's lots of things to remember, and we were all dreadful at it. There are funny things that you had to put on. No one did it really well, and instantly you'd pass the test, you'd forget all about it. Until Iraq in 1991, 92, where there was a real risk, there was a real threat. Everyone suddenly became experts at nuclear, biological and chemical protection kit. Literally overnight, people had studied this stuff and memorized things painfully. When it was relevant, it was learnt, and more importantly, 3-4 years later, people who'd learnt it still remembered it. but the key thing was it was really relevant and important to people. I'm coming to the end of my pitch. You haven't nudged me as yet. Oh, just about to. What is the purpose of a skills program? What is the purpose of an educational program? The mantra we used to use, immodestly, the mantra I used to use, is the whole purpose of this is to produce independent, motivated, and confident learners, lifelong learners, independent, confident, and motivated. They have to be autonomous. They have to take charge. Intrinsic motivation has to kick in. They've got to feel a sense that they're doing what is best for them. They're making an informed, good choice for them. This applies whether it's skills, by the way, or education. The second thing is they have to be confident that they can learn. They have to be, you know, their expectations themselves is, yes, I can do this. This is not impossible. This is not out of reach. And the third thing, of course, is they have to be motivated. They've got to want to do this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. And I think that's a very important mantra: independent, confident, and motivated. Just before I throw it open to the floor, just one or two points I just want to pick up from that, the whole of the presentations. First of all, TVET routes to higher education. Yes, higher education is still incredibly important. We still need a lot of scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians, etc., etc. But do we need to really think about other routes through? Secondly, confidence building. A lot of this is about building confidence in young people and how we manage to do that. And I think it's very interesting, following on from David's presentation, that the British government this week has put the definition of apprenticeships back into the hands of industry, of employers. Until now, and for the last 10, 15 years, it was defined effectively by educationalists working with industrialists. Literally this week, it has put it back into the hands of industrialists. And I think that says something about, certainly something about the British economy, but needing it to be kickstart. But I think that's the way that things are happening in some of the countries we've got. And I think there's another point that we've not touched on, which I suspect we will touch on, and that is whether we actually want qualifications or whether we need skills, and what the difference is between the two, and whether in fact what we've got now are qualifications that really are not fit for purpose, and what we need are skills programs that we can recognise across different parts of countries, different parts of the world, in kind of mutual recognition systems, rather than something more structured. So with those thoughts, and with considerable thanks to the panelists, can we have your questions, please? Right.
Alan. I think many of us accept the fact that we need to have a diverse curriculum, providing flexibility for vocational training and academic training in schools. But the reality in many developing countries is that, one, in the secondary schools particularly, you have great deficits in terms of ability to teach the very basic sciences, the very basic mathematics. You don't have the right teachers to take on the additional burden of vocational education and training. And further, industry in many of these countries is more interested at the higher level skills in contrast to these lower level skills. So the interest in participating at the secondary level is rather constrained. They're more inclined to participate at the higher level. So it's then very difficult in these countries to have this flexibility in curriculum, including vocational education and training.
Okay.
Now, what we're doing, I'm from Zambia, and from the Ministry of Education, I'm responsible for vocational education and training and higher education. One of the models we're using is certainly to have the curriculum framework that provides for this flexibility, but to seek to implement it through a combination of existing institutions, vocational training institutions, and secondary schools, in contrast to us asking the secondary schools to implement it.
Right. Okay.
Now, it's difficult because it means that you have a curriculum which is implemented through a coordination of institutions,
Sure.
in contrast to expecting that outcome from out of a single institution.
Yeah.
Now, we're seeking to do this, and of course we share the results as we get there.
Yeah.
But we think that this model
Yeah.
of collaboration between vocational training institutions with
Yeah.
specific expertise and schools can provide for the complementarity, where you have severe constraints, particularly in secondary schools.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Manfred, would you like to pick that up?
Well, if I understand it well, then you are advocating a kind of a close cooperation between different schools on different stages. That is indeed one of the points we are working on as well. I think when young people are at in a secondary school, it's very important to provide them with information about future opportunities, to provide them with information, and maybe not only information, but just to give them a kind of orientation in the world of work. And many youngsters, and that is really a problem, it's also in our country certainly the case, make a wrong choice because they simply do not know where the choice is based on. So starting already at the age of 14, 15 was giving them a good picture. If they continue then, for example, at the vocational education and training institution, it should always, we have 3 pillars for our vocational education and training. That is 1, qualifying for the labor market, 2, qualifying for follow-up study, and 3, learning them citizenship, taking responsibility. These are the 3 main pillars. So, as I already said, no dead ends and giving them the opportunity to end up at a higher level. And I'm sure you can gain a lot when there is a regional cooperation between a VET institution and a higher education institution. If you can, not simply 4 years VET and 4 years higher education. If you compare the program in VET and if it is a follow-up study that fits, you can gain a lot of time.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point, and I think your approach is a very interesting one, and I think if you think also about adding in if it's possible, the higher education element as well, so it's kind of tripartite system, I think that's very helpful. There are lots of hands up. If I could ask you to make your questions fairly short, that would be great, please. Sorry. Oh, you have a mic.
Yes.
Sorry, okay.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm eager to speak because I'm in a bit of a dilemma, and I hope the speakers will be able to clarify certain things to clear my mind. My name is Dr. Brahma Jame. I am Director of Curriculum at the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education in the Gambia. My dilemma is that if some of you will remember, in the 70s towards 80s, there was this big issue of diversifying secondary education. That means providing both academic and technical skills. Along the line, there has been a lot of arguments saying that, is it possible for the schools to predict what skills are going to be needed in the future for schools to appropriately provide these skills to the students? And I know World Bank actually has been a leading institution in that. In the UK, I stand to be corrected. In the 1988 Education Reform Act, there has been a lot of arguments, about the TVET, Technical and Vocational Education Initiatives, and stuff like that. And in the developing countries like my own country, we have changed from that diversified secondary initiative. Of course, technical schools were constructed and we had problems of teachers and equipment and stuff like that. So we have now changed to what we call basic education. And the idea for this basic education is actually providing pre-vocational and stuff like that. So given this dilemma, especially the argument that can schools actually predict what skills will be needed in the economy, given the changing economic circumstances that we are facing. What is your take on that? What kind of curriculum reform are you thinking, or what kind of curriculum reform are you promoting? It's my own dilemma, given these previous arguments and the changes that we have been undergoing. That's my question.
Okay, thank you. I think the absolute certainty is whatever set of skills you decide are relevant and important now, in 5 years' time, the situation is likely to be different. So can you create a system, central system, that accurately predicts the skill sets your workers will need in 5 or 10 years? The answer is no. But I think what you can do is develop a curriculum that gives you a broad base of the sort of soft skills which will be enduring. The need to work with others, the need to communicate effectively, the need to analyze problems in a logical way. I think those will endure, but the specific skill sets, I think, will change, and the best place to address them, for me, is actually in employment. I think we've had a number of models here. And the educational model we follow here really is only about 100 years old. Skilled tradesmen have existed for millennia, and previously they would learn for master craftsmen. The artisan route of qualification, 7-year apprenticeships, 100 years ago used to be the norm. Get children exposed to the disciplines, the joys, the satisfaction, the rewards of the workplace. I'm not suggesting you use child labor, but get them so they're familiar. They're making an informed choice about what employment area is going to satisfy them, going to work for them, and then introduce them to the skills once they get actually into the workforce, for me, is the better way of doing it. So the partnership, rather than being between schools and vocational colleges, the more important partnership is with schools, vocational colleges on one side, and employers on the other.
Thank you very much, David. I think that's a very, very important point. There's another point I'd just like to add to that, which I think applies to a lot of people here, that the education system you introduce must be the right education system for your country. And there have been a number of examples where education systems have been planted into developing countries and they don't work terribly well. And I think you need to learn from other people's experiences, but actually define them in the way that makes sense for you.
Good afternoon. I'm Kamar Zaman from Pakistan. My question is for David Wilson, and this is with reference to his previous job that he talked about. And very interesting to hear that in the British Army, the recruits, within a few weeks of having completed their recruit training, are then put into apprenticeship trainings. I would have thought that a recruit, an infantry soldier, would probably maybe require much more to go and learn in his own field crafts and things. But that's a very interesting thing that you mentioned. Why is apprenticeship training kind of being given that kind of importance? And also, usually in the armed forces, the apprenticeship training comes at a point when they're about to retire and they go and join the general workforce. So how is this being kind of contemplated in the British Army?
The system you described was a sort of prevailing system about 40 years ago. It started to change then, and what we currently have, let's say if you look at basic military training, which is universal, everyone does it, there'll be elements in there, things like map reading, for example, things like planning a particular journey, taking the right sort of equipment along, this is back to the point about making it relevant. So those are educational, they're unabashedly educational. We teach them as educational competencies that they need. We also credit it. They won't be aware that this is going to add up and help them develop a portfolio later, but we do measure what they're doing, record what they're doing, and when they get through their basic training, and the infantry do another 6 months of training, by the way, so it's 12 weeks basic and then another 6 months before they join their first unit. And even though we recruit people at age 15 years, 9 months, it's the youngest, no one goes into combat under the age of 18. That's over the last 10 years. So throughout, they'll be training. There is never a time, or the entire military population where people aren't being trained, aren't being developed or whatever. We have to grow all our own generals, and we grow them from the material that joins. So training is an absolutely continuous process, and training and education just gets woven into everything people do. Okay.
Alan Marshall, GEMS. There's a belief that the cost of delivering a broad range of skills programs is high. You know, they're resource intensive, small classes, etc. Is this a real or perceived barrier to change?
Sorry, I'm not sure whether I understood your question well. About the size of classes?
I'm just saying, you know, the cost of delivering broad base of skills programs is perceived as being very high. Is this actually a barrier to actually change?
Okay. Well, we spoke about different models, and if we take the work-based learning model, let's say in a kind of dual system, where a large part of the learning will be done in company, there is a kind of, well, it's a very rough way of counting, but it says if you have a training of, let's say, 3 years, which is an average training to get to the level of a skilled worker, you need to invest in the first year. It's break even in the second year, and you will have profit in the third year. That's very roughly saying. But I think in general, and that there has been some research about that. In general, you can say that in a blended learning system, dual learning system, you will get the best value for money. That's for sure. And well, looking to the investment, I think that's the best investment you can make if you reach a kind of blended learning system.
Thank you very much. I think that's an important point, that very last point. I think some studies have been done in the UK again. Oh, sorry, it's the UK again. But it is a system that's had a lot of experimentation, I think is a good way of putting it. And I think it has shown that if you do invest in vocational education and training, after 5 years, you get a very massive return on that investment. And in fact, it's less than 5 years. I think it's at the end of 3 years. And you can actually look at multipliers, which are around about 20 times. If you look somewhere down the line, if you invest in that multiple in that. I also think, and Manfred's touched on another point, and I suspect there'll be some questions about that, that you can actually use technology much more effectively now for vocational education and training than you used to be able to in the past because of MOOCs, because of smartphones, smart technologies. Anyway, next question, please. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, costs versus return on investment, I think one of the things that we see is a huge lack of investment in early career counselling for young people. So clearly, if young people end up doing the wrong vocational training, or they end up going into vocational training because somebody pushed them into it rather than because they have a particular passion for it, that's when you start to see high levels of failure and high levels of dropout rates. And, you know, I see it again in the UK, where you see, for example, a lot of young people being pushed into formal academic training, knowing that they're really not that interested in it, but not knowing where the alternative lies, and no systematic counselling or coaching at school that this is what vocational looks like. What we're seeing here in the UAE is that there is a huge demand now for, as I said before, scientists and engineers, not just for the oil industry. You have a big expansion in the aerospace industry. And when we ask young people, you know, what they think the private sector is, they say, well, that's banking, isn't it? And they simply don't know. The private sector, meanwhile, is not necessarily getting access to explain. I talk to people in the oil and gas sector, they tell me, I'm desperate to find a petroleum engineer. Admittedly, that's more formally qualified than VET. And these guys will graduate on a salary of $150,000 a year. Now, I think young people, if they knew these things earlier on in life, that, you know, you can go on and do broad-based business and marketing education, a formal degree, but actually, if you look at some of engineering is, of course, more a formal academic training, but I think if people understood the value proposition of more technical jobs, then they would because traditionally they're not sent down that route, neither by their families nor the schools. And we have various programs that give people simple things like a taster day, where we take young people and we just plonk them inside, not quite plonk, but embed them inside a company just for a day. And you'd be amazed at what a difference that makes. Just being able to walk around either an office place or if they're an oil and gas company, the outdoor facilities, and say, huh, I never knew that working in this sector, that's what that looks and sounds and feels like. And what a tiny investment that is, to take young people and just give them a taste today, or even better, internships, that you can then start to reduce the long-term rates of failure, because you're giving young people exposure to a technical, scientific, engineering degree or qualification or career, whatever, at a much earlier age. And we have, again, a science competition where we're asking young people to just apply science so that they don't get turned off by technical careers, because they understand it actually applies to the real. And I think there needs to be a huge amount of investment in raising awareness of young people of what technical careers look and sound like and how they can access them.
May I add one word? I'm always surprised. It's in fact ridiculous. Young children are curious. Young children like to know how technical things work. They like to find out things. Somehow they lose this interest during their school career, and then they all want to become to have white collars. And it's in fact ridiculous that we have a working force, people who are a kind of a concrete backbone of a healthy economy. Some 50 or 60 people, 60% of a workforce needs to have a vocational education training background. That these people are all, the most of them have made a negative choice. They have become professionals because they were not able to follow an academic study, which is, in my opinion, ridiculous.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, Tim Emmett from GEMS. Question for David Wilson. The way you tell it, David, it sounds great. I think there are many people in this room who would like to know how that kind of focused approach to technical and vocational training could be translated economically and cost effectively into their highly differently resourced economies with the outcomes that you got and get in the British Army.
I think the key, and it's really drawing on the point Claire's just made, the key is to get people into the workplace as soon as possible, whether it's to help them make an informed choice about what pathway they want to follow, whether it's to expose them to role models. People and role models aren't just master craftsmen or skilled practitioners. They're people who really enjoy and are rewarded by what they do. I think the most important selling point is to meet people you respect, who are doing what they love doing, and say it's actually relatively easy to make the transition from where you are to where you want to be. I think if you get those things right, these are not resource-intense things. Helping people make an informed choice about their future employment, but getting them into the workplace, because, dare I say it, in terms, most of the people in this room don't have a skills background. I spent 10 years working as an electrical engineer. I probably have more of a skills background in terms of practical experience. Not that it was great, by the way. That's why I stopped doing it. I wasn't very good at it. But we need to get people like that talking about how you can attract people into the workplace that they love and that they are master practitioners in. I think there's been a tendency to put too much into the training before people get into the workplace. And the training bit is not that interesting for most people. Getting into the workplace is.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Kevin Dunseith, Director of Global Education with Cisco. I wanted to pick up on your point, Sue, about the use of technology in TVET, and to ask whether the panel had had any experience of the application in that way, because it seems to me that the landscape of higher education has changed dramatically with the advent of MOOCs. Now, certainly the appropriate and effective use of technology can allow the scaling of scarce teaching resources, for example. It can allow the archiving and retrieval of learning materials so that they're not just gone with the wind. You can go back and review the material. It also, I think, overcomes challenges of security and logistics that we're seeing, for example, in Libya today and in Iraq also. It is cost efficient, I think, also. And finally, I think it increases motivation, because you can give learners access to state-of-the-art materials. Now, I'm not saying that that will replace, of course, the face-to-face instructor, but it could well be a hybrid model that would be very effective. So I just wonder whether anybody has had any experience of that kind of thing. Thank you.
I can't say a huge experience, but I used to sit on the board of a youth development NGO charity in the UK, and one of the models we looked at was the Khan Academy, which has an amazing approach to actually taking content and rendering it much more user-friendly and versatile and accessible. And the Khan Academy is now, as you probably know, being recognized worldwide as kind of best practice in terms of teaching methodology, because it's fun, it's interesting, people like learning that way, you can move forwards, you can move backwards at your own pace. And I think that kind of thing is wonderful, but the challenge, certainly what I would see in the region around introducing that kind of approach is it's pretty radical, B, it demands a holistic approach to curriculum reform. And what you're often seeing, in different parts of the world, but here's no exception, is that curriculum is being reformed at the level of the school or the level of the public sector or the level of the private sector, and you're not seeing a holistic approach where people are saying moving into cyberspace is clearly the way to go, and that it's kind of an inevitability, but how you do it at a countrywide approach to it is I think quite scary for a lot of people that are perhaps not so comfortable in cyberspace.
Just in terms of a practical example of technology helping, I'll pick a completely neutral subject. There's a long list of potential options. Catering training, preparing vegetables, slicing carrots. You've got one instructor with cameras looking at the students' work desks. One instructor can cover 20 or 30 very easily and very quickly just by flicking around the different things. More importantly, the student can access a video of the demonstration if they're not sure about a particular approach, and they can also record their view, so when they get a grade for whatever the subject is, and they need to understand what they can do better, they've got access. A very simple device, unbelievably cheap, because once you've installed it, there are no overheads, and as soon as you put that sort of technology in the hands of committed trainers, teachers, and students, they generate so many different ways of using it imaginatively. It's wonderful.
Thank you, David. And I've seen two examples. One, the use of serious games on an international basis across Europe, where a game had been developed and was being beamed across classrooms in 5 or 6 different nations, which was around about planning skills. And it was through the context of a city that was being built. And the kids were working together collaboratively in different languages, learning language skills and skills of collaboration through what is now known as a serious game, which some of you, of course, will know about. Secondly, use of smartphones, smart technologies, Androids, etc., to upload demonstrations. People can practice them, they can watch them, they can even demonstrate on them. So you can actually practice your skills with the use of your own technology before you have to be assessed. And I think that's the kind of way we're going to move forward in the future. Okay, gentleman here, and then Mel, and then that lady there.
Good morning, the panelists. Good morning, colleagues. I'm Malan Jatra, policy analyst, the Gambia. Now, my concern is I'm countering, you've all talked about the importance of technology in education, which cannot be overemphasized. My concern now is, as technology has both the advantages and disadvantages, we've seen the proliferation of arms in which it was made in order to protect countries and human beings. But if it gets to the wrong person or people who are using it to their own selfish interest, it can go out of hand and it can make a lot of destructions. Now, in terms of bringing in technology in education, are there mechanisms in place to protect, especially the guy from Cisco, are there mechanisms in place to protect these children or to guide them in order for them not to abuse this technology? Because it obviously has its disadvantages, so that if these children are not guided well, they can use it otherwise, which is not the purpose of it. Thank you.
That's a very important question. Cybersecurity, security of using technology is vital in all systems, all sectors, frankly. I think there are more and more concerns about that, and also programs that schools and others go through to become aware of those particular issues. And I also think that one of the things we've alluded to but haven't explored very much is around the whole of the teachers and teachers' awareness of that as well, and teachers' ability to be able to use the technology, because very often the children are miles ahead of the teachers. And the teachers are quite frightened, and actually teachers and children have to start learning together technology. We're almost out of time. I'm really sorry. I know there are a lot more questions. I think it's been a very interesting session. I think we could have gone on an awful lot longer. I do apologise. Have you got a very, 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 very quick question? Right, then very quickly, because otherwise I'm going to get killed.
I'll try and save you for that. Just one question, and we had some lovely discussions throughout, which are very informative. But thinking about what we can take back to school, and especially for our students, I really want to know, is it possible on each city level that big education companies such as GEMS and companies such as Emirates can set up a framework where all the main employers open up a week of work experience or apprenticeship? Because what we find is we replicate the process in each and every skill, and that is a lot of hour, a lot of time, and that is cost. So if there is a framework where all employers open up a week and all school students can apply for that, so they're not only having an opportunity to look at work nature, but can work together. So skills which they will be needing later on. And it makes it really easy for schools then to look at what is needed, guide students, and it will give a large number of students a platform.
I think that's a really, really important point, and one which we will definitely take back. And thank you very much for making it. And thank you to everybody else. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. I think it's schools, TVET, higher education, industry, philanthropic organisations all working together. Very important. Quality training, very important. Confidence building, let's not forget that. That's a vital part of all of this. And let's not forget that the very best vocational education and training is demonstrated by medicine or veterinary science, and indeed engineering. And so when we talk about vet being for lower level skills or for people that can't do, in actual fact there is an enormous amount of very high quality vocational education and training, and we should be thinking about it in that context too. But thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the panelists as well. Enjoy the rest of the day.